Eastern Montana, November to 1948. While his neighbors reinforced their pole barns and three-sided sheds, 63-year-old Lars Eriksson was stacking hay bales in a perfect circle on the windswept prairie 5 miles north of Circle, Montana. They called him stubborn. They called him reckless. Some called him worse. What they didn't know was that this Norwegian rancher carried a memory, a fragment of knowledge from the old country that would soon mean the difference between survival and devastation. In 6 weeks, the worst winter in 75 years would descend on the northern plains. Temperatures would plunge to 50 below zero. Wind would howl at sustained speeds that turned snow into horizontal knives. And when spring finally broke in March 1949, the accounting would be brutal. But before we reveal what happened, I want to know, where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you want to discover the forgotten survival technique that saved an entire herd when modern methods failed, hit that subscribe button right now. Because what Lars Eriksson understood about thermal mass and insulation would challenge everything his neighbors thought they knew about winter ranching. They laughed at his hay dome, until it became the only structure standing. Lars Eriksson's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he positioned the first ring of hay bales 40 feet across. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the stubbled wheat field he'd chosen for the structure, 300 yards from his modest ranch house. His son, Martin, 27 and newly returned from the war, watched with barely concealed skepticism. "Pa, we've got a perfectly good barn. Why are we building this thing?" Lars straightened, his weathered face creasing into something between a smile and a grimace. "Your grandfather built one of these outside Trondheim in 1891. Saved 40 head when every other farmer within 20 miles lost their stock." Martin had heard the story. Everyone in the family had. But hearing about a hay shelter in Norway was one thing. Actually constructing one on Montana rangeland in 1948 was another. The design was deceptively simple. Hay bales, each weighing approximately 70 pounds, stacked in a circular pattern with an interior diameter of 40 feet. But the construction method revealed sophistication that most neighbors would miss entirely. Lars wasn't just piling bales. He was engineering a double-wall system with a critical 12-inch air gap between the inner and outer walls. The bales themselves were compressed tight, 14 inches thick per bale, creating density that would prove essential. He oriented each bale with the string side facing inward, maximizing structural integrity. "The air space is what matters," Lars explained, tamping down the first course with methodical precision. Hay insulates. Air insulates. Together, they create something stronger than either one alone. By the third day of construction, word had spread through the ranching community. Tom Bradley, who ran 2,000 head on the adjacent property, rode over on his sorrel gelding. He sat in the saddle, arms crossed, watching Lars and Martin work. "Eriksson, that's the damnedest thing I've ever seen," Bradley said, not bothering to hide his amusement. "You planning to winter your cattle in a haystack?" Lars didn't look up from his work. "Planning to keep them alive." Bradley laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that carried across the prairie. "I've got a $12,000 pole barn with a steel roof and windbreak panels. You got a pile of hay shaped like an Indian hut. We'll see who's laughing come February." But Lars kept building. The walls rose 8 feet high, then 10. At 12 feet, he began the gradual inward cant that would form the dome's characteristic shape. Each bale overlapped the one below it, offset by 6 inches, creating a spiraling pattern that distributed weight and prevented collapse. The entrance faced southeast, away from the prevailing northwest winds. Lars built it narrow, just wide enough for cattle to pass through single file, and angled it inward 15 degrees. This seemingly minor detail would create a baffle effect, preventing direct wind penetration while allowing animals to enter and exit freely. Martin began to see the logic. The circular design eliminated corners where wind could batter and probe. The dome shape would shed snow rather than accumulate it. And the sheer mass of hay. Lars estimated they'd used 480 bales, roughly 16 tons, represented thermal mass on a scale that conventional barns couldn't match. It's not just shelter, Lars said on the seventh day, as they positioned the final cap bales at the structure's apex. It's a living system. The hay breathes. It absorbs moisture from the cattle during the day and releases it at night when they're bedded down. It flexes with the wind instead of fighting it. And if we get the snowfall I think we're going to get, that snow will add another layer of insulation on top. Martin drove the last bale into position. From ground level, the structure looked massive, a smooth, organic dome rising 14 feet at its center, with walls that curved inward like a traditional Scandinavian stabber or the Sami goatee his grandfather had described. Within 2 weeks, 5 more neighbors had ridden over to inspect the hay igloo. None of them were impressed. Carl Peterson, a third-generation rancher who'd weathered 40 Montana winters, shook his head slowly. Lars, I respect your old country ways, but this is 1948. We've got engineered lumber, we've got insulated steel, we've got forced air circulation systems. That thing might have worked in Norway 100 years ago, but out here in a real winter, it's going to collapse or blow apart. Lars just nodded. Maybe so, but he'd already moved his breeding stock, 42 Hereford cows and 1 bull, into the hay dome. They'd adjusted to the space within hours, bedding down in the thick straw he'd spread across the interior floor. The temperature inside, even without body heat, measured 8 degrees warmer than the outside air. By early December, the first significant snow had fallen, 6 inches overnight, with temperatures dropping to 12 above zero. Bradley's pole barn performed exactly as expected: solid, functional, expensive. Lars's hay dome sat silent on the prairie, slowly accumulating a white blanket that would soon become something far more significant than decoration. What Lars Eriksson had built wasn't just a shelter. It was a thermal battery, a living structure that would soon face the most severe test the Northern Plains had seen since 1874. And while his neighbors checked weather forecasts with growing unease, Lars simply added more straw bedding and made sure his cattle had access to water. He'd done everything his grandfather had taught him. Now, all he could do was wait. The Circle, Montana Cattlemen's Association, held its December meeting in the back room of Henderson's Feed and Grain. 23 ranchers showed up, tracking snow and manure across the rough plank floor, filling the air with tobacco smoke and the smell of wet wool. Tom Bradley brought up the Eriksson situation during open discussion. "I'm not trying to embarrass the man," Bradley said, standing near the potbelly stove, "but we've got a responsibility to each other. Lars has built what amounts to a 40-foot pile of combustible material and stuck 43 head of cattle inside it. If that thing catches fire, it'll be seen from Miles City." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. Robert Henshaw, the county agricultural extension agent, cleared his throat. Henshaw had a degree from Montana State College and 7 years of experience advising ranchers on modern livestock management techniques. "I visited the Eriksson property last week," Henshaw said, pulling a small notebook from his jacket pocket. "The structure in question measures approximately 40 feet in diameter with walls 12 feet high, constructed entirely of compressed hay bales. No internal framework, no foundation, no ventilation system beyond a single entrance." He paused, letting the implications settle. "Gentlemen, I've reviewed the engineering standards for livestock housing in cold climates. The Eriksson structure violates every principle of modern barn design. Inadequate air exchange will lead to dangerous ammonia buildup from urine. The moisture from 40-plus animals will saturate those hay bales, reducing their insulation value and creating conditions for spontaneous combustion. And the structural load, we're talking about roughly 33,000 pounds of hay supporting itself with no internal bracing. The first significant wind event will collapse the entire thing, possibly with livestock trapped inside." Carl Peterson raised his hand. "Bob, what's your official recommendation?" Henshaw didn't hesitate. Mr. Eriksson should immediately relocate his breeding stock to conventional shelter. That hay dome, whatever his intentions, represents a hazard to animal welfare and possibly to surrounding properties. The vote was unanimous. The association would send a formal letter to Lars Eriksson expressing their concerns and urging him to adopt standard practices. But the technical arguments ran deeper than Henshaw's public comment suggested. Modern pole barn design in 1948 represented decades of agricultural engineering refinement. A typical structure like Bradley's incorporated 6x6 treated posts sunk 4 feet into the ground, supporting engineered trusses capable of handling snow loads up to 40 pounds per square foot. Steel roofing panels shed precipitation efficiently. Strategically placed vents created controlled air circulation, pulling fresh air in at ground level and exhausting warm, moisture-laden air through ridge vents at the peak. The cost reflected this sophistication. Bradley's barn had run him $12,000, roughly equivalent to 2 years' gross income from his cattle operation. Lars Eriksson's hay dome had cost him exactly nothing beyond labor. The hay bales were his own, cut from his own fields. The straw bedding was surplus from his wheat harvest. Even the string binding the bales came from his existing supplies. This economic reality grated on some of his neighbors more than they cared to admit. "It's not just about safety," Bradley said privately to Peterson after the meeting. "If that crazy Norwegian proves you can winter cattle in a pile of hay, what's that say about the rest of us who've spent small fortunes on proper barns?" But Eriksson's design did incorporate engineering principles, just not the ones his neighbors recognized. The 12-inch air gap between the inner and outer hay walls created a dead air space that functioned exactly like the insulation cavity in a modern wall. Air, when trapped and prevented from convection currents, has an R value of approximately 3.6 per inch. 12 inches of dead air space theoretically provided R43 insulation, better than most modern homes. The hay itself added another layer. Compressed hay bales have an R value between 2.4 and 3.0 per inch, depending on density. At 14 inches thick per bale, each wall layer contributed roughly R35. Combined with the air gap, the total wall R value approached R113, higher than any conventional barn of the era. The dome shape distributed structural loads through compression rather than requiring internal supports. Each bale pressed against its neighbors, creating a self-supporting arch. The principle was ancient, identical to stone domes built by cultures from Rome to Persia, but entirely foreign to ranchers accustomed to post and beam construction. Moisture management was the genuine wild card. Henshaw was correct that 43 cattle produce substantial water vapor, approximately 200 pounds per day, through respiration and evaporation. In a sealed environment, this moisture would indeed saturate the hay and create problems. But Lars hadn't built a sealed environment. The hay itself breathed, allowing moisture to migrate through the bale structure. The entrance, though baffled against wind, permitted constant air exchange. And most critically, the hay's hygroscopic properties, its natural tendency to absorb and release moisture in response to relative humidity, created a passive climate control system. During the day, as cattle activity peaked and moisture levels rose, the hay absorbed excess humidity. At night, as temperatures dropped and cattle bedded down, the hay slowly released that moisture, preventing condensation and ice buildup on interior surfaces. Martin Eriksson, working through the physics with pencil and paper at the kitchen table one evening, began to understand what his grandfather had known intuitively. "It's not a building, Pa. It's more like a living organism." Lars smiled. "Your grandfather called it a breathing house. The old Sami had them in the Arctic. The Norwegians used them in the mountains. It's not new. We just forgot." By December 20th, temperatures had dropped to 18 below zero. Bradley's pole barn required supplemental heating, 2 propane heaters running continuously to maintain temperature above freezing. His feed costs increased as cattle burned more calories fighting the cold. Inside the hay dome, with no supplemental heat, the temperature held at 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The cattle's own body heat, combined with the thermal mass of the hay walls and the insulation value of the structure, maintained conditions 36 degrees warmer than the outside air. Lars checked his herd twice daily. They were calm, their coats dry, their breathing normal. Condensation that would have dripped from the ceiling of a conventional barn was instead absorbed into the hay overhead, keeping the interior surface dry. On December 23rd, the first major storm system appeared on weather forecasts. The National Weather Service issued advisories for eastern Montana. Significant snow accumulation expected, followed by Arctic air mass pushing down from Canada. Bradley stopped by the Erickson place on Christmas Eve. He found Lars forking hay to his cattle through the dome's entrance, moving efficiently in the dim light filtering through the structure. "Storm's coming," Bradley said. "I know. You sure about this thing?" Lars straightened, leaning on his pitchfork. "Tom, I'm not sure about anything except that my grandfather survived worse than this with less. That's going to have to be enough." Bradley nodded slowly, then rode back toward his own operation. He had 73 head in his $12,000 barn, ventilation fans humming, propane heaters burning through fuel at $12 per day. Lars had 43 head in a pile of hay that had cost him nothing. In 72 hours, they would both discover whose engineering was superior. The barometric pressure began its precipitous drop on December 27th. By evening, the sky had taken on that peculiar greenish-gray cast that veteran plainsmen recognized as a herald of serious weather. The wind, which had been gusting from the northwest at 15 miles per hour, suddenly went dead calm. Lars stood in his yard, studying the sky with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read weather before radio forecasts existed. The temperature had risen slightly, always a bad sign before a major storm. It now hovered at 22 degrees, having climbed from a morning low of 14 below. "This is it," he said quietly to Martin, who'd come out to join him. Inside the hay dome, the cattle sensed the change. They moved restlessly, their breath creating visible clouds in the still air. Lars had spent the afternoon making final preparations, and now he walked Martin through his reasoning for each decision. The entrance faced southeast at precisely 135 degrees from true north. The prevailing wind comes from the northwest at about 305 degrees, Lars explained, sketching the angles in the snow with a stick. By facing the opening southeast, we create a 170-degree offset. The wind has to curve almost completely around the structure to reach the entrance, and by then it's lost most of its velocity. The entrance itself was a masterpiece of empirical engineering. At 4 feet wide and 7 feet high, it was barely large enough for a single cow to pass through comfortably. But Lars had angled the walls inward at 15 degrees, creating a funnel effect. Wind attempting to enter the structure would compress and accelerate, creating back pressure that effectively sealed the opening against all but the most extreme gusts. Inside, the floor plan revealed further sophistication. The cattle had naturally arranged themselves in a loose circle around the perimeter, leaving the center area open. This wasn't random. It was precisely the arrangement Lars had anticipated. Cattle generate about 1,500 BTUs per hour each when they're resting, Lars said, though Martin suspected his father had learned this through observation rather than calculation. 43 head means roughly 64,500 BTUs per hour. In a conventional barn with high ceilings and poor insulation, most of that heat rises and escapes. Here, the dome's shape and the thermal mass of the hay capture it. He'd measured the interior temperature that morning, 34 degrees Fahrenheit, with an outside reading of 14 below, a 48-degree differential maintained purely through passive design and animal heat. The hay walls themselves had warmed to approximately 28 degrees on the interior surface, creating a radiant heat effect that conventional wisdom said was impossible with an unheated structure. The bedding layer told another story. Lars had spread wheat straw 12 inches deep across the entire floor, roughly 4 tons of material. This served multiple functions: insulation from ground cold, absorption of moisture and waste, and additional thermal mass that would warm slowly throughout the day and release heat gradually overnight. You can't see it, but there's a temperature gradient happening through these walls, Lars said, running his hand across the hay surface. The exterior bales are probably close to outside temperature, maybe 10, 15 below right now. But each layer going inward is warmer because the air gaps trap heat and the hay itself has thermal mass. By the time you get to the inside surface, you're looking at near freezing. That means the walls themselves are acting like a heat battery. Martin had begun keeping detailed records. His notebook showed December 20th, outside minus 18 degrees Fahrenheit, inside plus 28 degrees Fahrenheit, 46 degrees differential. December 22nd, outside minus 23 degrees Fahrenheit, inside plus 24 degrees Fahrenheit, 47 degrees differential. December 24th, outside minus 8 degrees Fahrenheit, inside plus 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 44 degrees differential. December 27th, outside plus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, inside plus 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees differential. The pattern was consistent. The hay dome maintained an interior temperature approximately 45 degrees warmer than outside conditions, with only minor variations based on wind speed and cloud cover. Bradley's operation told a different story. His pole barn, with its modern ventilation system and 2 propane heaters, maintained temperature at 38 degrees when outside temperature was at 20 below. That was acceptable, sufficient to prevent water from freezing and keep cattle comfortable. But it required continuous energy input, approximately $80 per week in propane during severe cold, plus electricity for ventilation fans. The hay dome required nothing. No fuel, no electricity, just the sun, the cattle, and a thermal mass of 16 tons of compressed hay. On the morning of December 28th, the first snowflakes began falling. They came down vertically, fat and heavy, accumulating quickly. By noon, 4 inches covered the ground. By evening, 10 inches. The wind remained eerily calm. Lars made his final preparations. He filled the water trough inside the dome, a galvanized tank that he'd insulated with straw bales on all sides. He forked in enough hay to last 3 days, stacking it against the northern wall, where it would remain accessible even if drifts blocked the entrance. "You really think it's going to be that bad?" Martin asked. Lars didn't answer directly. Instead, he said, "Your grandfather told me about the winter of 1891. The snow came first, 3 feet in 2 days. Then the temperature dropped to 40 below and stayed there for 6 weeks. The wind blew so hard that snow would hit your face like sand. Cattle froze, standing up in the fields. Horses suffocated in their stalls when barn doors got blocked shut." He paused, looking at the hay dome. The farmers who had these structures, they lost nothing. Not one head. Everyone else was ruined. By December 29th, the snow had reached 18 inches. The wind finally arrived, a low, sustained howl from the northwest that drove the temperature down to 30 below zero by evening. The blizzard had begun. The hay dome disappeared into a white maelstrom. Snow accumulated on the windward side, building a massive drift that eventually reached halfway up the structure's height. But the dome's shape shed the load efficiently. Snow that might have crushed a flat roof or battered down vertical walls simply slid off the curved surface, creating a natural aerodynamic profile. Inside, the cattle barely noticed. The temperature dropped to 26 degrees, 8 degrees colder than before the storm, but still 56 degrees warmer than the screaming chaos outside. The entrance remained clear. Lars had predicted this too. The southeast-facing and the inward-angled walls created a pocket of low pressure that prevented snow from accumulating. Drifts built up on either side of the opening, but the entrance itself remained passable. Bradley, fighting to keep his barn doors clear with a coal shovel, watched the distant dome vanish into horizontal sheets of snow. He couldn't see it anymore, but he knew it was there. And he wondered, for the first time, if maybe the old Norwegian wasn't crazy after all. The temperature continued to drop. 35 below, 40 below. The wind sustained at 35 miles per hour with gusts to 55. The National Weather Service reported it as the worst blizzard conditions since January 1874. It would last for 11 days. The thermometer outside the Erickson Ranch house stopped registering temperature on January 2nd. The mercury column had retracted to its lowest mark, 50 below zero, and showed no intention of rising. Inside the house, Lars and Martin huddled near the kitchen stove, burning wood at a rate that would empty their supply by February if the cold persisted. The windows had frosted over completely, creating intricate ice patterns 3 inches thick on the interior glass. Every 2 hours, they had to chip away the frost just to see if daylight still existed. But Lars's mind wasn't on the house. It was on the cattle, invisible now beyond the white wall that surrounded them. "We need to check them," Martin said. Lars shook his head. "Not yet. The wind's too strong. We go out there, we might not make it back." It was a brutal calculation. The hay dome sat 300 yards from the house, normally a 3-minute walk. In these conditions, with visibility measured in feet and wind that could knock a man down, that 300 yards became a potentially fatal distance. Tom Bradley faced his own crisis. His pole barn's ventilation system had failed on December 30th when ice blocked the intake vents. Without fresh air circulation, carbon dioxide and ammonia from his 73 head of cattle build up to dangerous levels. He'd been forced to crack open the side door, just 4 inches, to allow air exchange. That 4-inch gap became a superhighway for Arctic air. The interior temperature, which had held at 38 degrees with heaters running, plummeted to 18 degrees within 2 hours. Bradley added a third propane heater, then a fourth. Fuel consumption quadrupled. His cattle huddled together in the building's southwest corner, as far as possible from the door, their breath creating a fog so thick he could barely see them from 15 feet away. By January 4th, his fuel supplier in Circle called to say they couldn't make deliveries. The roads were impassable, drifted shut with snow packed solid as concrete. Bradley had maybe 3 days of propane remaining. Carl Peterson's situation was worse. His barn, older than Bradley's and lacking modern insulation, required nearly constant supervision. The water system froze on January 1st, forcing him to haul buckets from his house. Well, a brutal, dangerous task in the sustained cold. 2 of his hands quit, unwilling to risk their lives for cattle. On January 5th, Peterson lost his first animal, a 3-year-old cow that simply lay down and didn't get up. The autopsy, performed weeks later when conditions allowed, would show pneumonia exacerbated by cold stress. She'd been burning more calories fighting the cold than she could consume and feed. Robert Henshaw, the county extension agent, sat in his office in Circle and compiled reports from ranchers who could reach him by telephone. The numbers told a grim story. Average herd mortality across the county, 8%, and climbing estimated feed consumption, 40% above normal due to cold stress fuel costs for barn heating. 300 to 400% above December averages documented cases of frostbite in livestock. Widespread calving operations. Suspended indefinitely due to cold, his secretary asked if he'd heard anything from the Erickson place. "Nothing," Henshaw said. "Phone lines are down out that direction." What Henshaw didn't know, what nobody beyond the Erickson property line knew, was that Lars's hay dome had essentially disappeared. Snowdrifts had buried the windward side completely, creating a massive white slope that reached 14 feet high and extended 30 feet outward. From a distance, the structure was invisible, indistinguishable from the surrounding drifts. But inside, conditions remained remarkably stable. On January 6th, when the wind finally dropped below 20 miles per hour, Lars and Martin made their first inspection. They roped themselves together with 70 feet of quarter-inch hemp line, standard procedure for blizzard work, and struggled through waist-deep snow toward where they knew the dome stood. The entrance was drifted shut with 4 feet of packed snow. It took them 40 minutes of hard digging to clear it, working in 15-minute shifts to prevent exhaustion. When Lars finally broke through and crawled inside, he found the cattle standing calmly, chewing cud, their coats dry and their eyes bright. The interior temperature measured 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, it was 47 below zero. Martin checked every animal systematically. No frostbite, no signs of respiratory distress, no injuries. The cattle had weathered the worst 6 days of the blizzard better than the humans in the house 300 yards away. "How is this possible?" Martin whispered. Lars ran his hand along the interior hay wall. It was warm to the touch, not body temperature warm, but noticeably warmer than the outside air. "The snow," he said. "Look at it." The massive drift on the windward side had done exactly what Lars had predicted it would. Snow, when packed and compressed by wind, has an R value of approximately 1.0 per inch. The 14-foot drift represented another R, 168 of insulation added to the already substantial R113 of the hay walls. But more importantly, the drift had transformed the dome from a hay structure into something approaching an igloo, the most thermally efficient shelter design humans have ever invented. The combination of circular shape, dome profile, and snow insulation created a thermal envelope so effective that the cattle's body heat alone, 64,500 BTUs per hour, was sufficient to maintain interior temperature 78 degrees warmer than the outside air. They forked in more hay, checked the water trough, still liquid, insulated by its own straw bale enclosure, and backed out through the entrance tunnel they dug. The cattle barely acknowledged their presence. "We need to tell Bradley," Martin said as they stumbled back toward the house. "Tell him what?" Lars asked. "That his $12,000 barn is being outperformed by a pile of hay." But the comparison was unavoidable. Bradley's barn, despite 4 propane heaters running continuously, maintained interior temperature at 12 degrees, 65 degrees colder than the hay dome. His fuel costs had exceeded $300 in 1 week. His cattle, stressed by cold and poor air quality, were losing weight and showing signs of respiratory infection. On January 8th, Bradley's propane finally ran out. The temperature inside his barn dropped to 6 below zero within 3 hours. He made the desperate decision to crowd all 73 head into the building's smallest room, a 12 by 16 equipment storage area, hoping their combined body heat would keep them alive until fuel could be delivered. It helped, but not enough. By January 10th, he lost 5 head. Carl Peterson lost 11. Across eastern Montana, ranchers with conventional barns and modern equipment watched helplessly as their herds suffered. The blizzard that had been predicted to last 3 to 5 days stretched into its second week with no sign of breaking. The National Weather Service would later classify the January 1949 blizzard as the worst winter storm in Montana history since 1874. Sustained temperatures below -40. Wind chills approaching -80. Snow accumulation exceeding 4 feet in areas where drifting allowed measurement. But inside a 40-foot dome of compressed hay bales, 43 Hereford cattle stood in comfort at 31 degrees Fahrenheit, protected by nothing more than ancient knowledge and the stubborn faith of one old Norwegian rancher. If you're watching this and realizing that maybe our modern solutions aren't always better than traditional wisdom, hit that like button right now. And subscribe, because what happens next, when spring finally arrives and the accounting begins, will change how these ranchers think about survival forever. Drop a comment and let me know, would you trust your herd to a pile of hay, or would you bet on modern engineering? The storm would rage for 3 more days. And when it finally broke on January 12th, the sun would rise on a landscape transformed into an Arctic desert, and on a community that would never look at traditional knowledge the same way again. January 13th dawned clear and brutally cold. The sun rose into a sky so crystalline blue it hurt to look at, reflecting off snow that sparkled like ground glass. The temperature had dropped even further overnight, -52 degrees Fahrenheit at 7 a.m., recorded on the one thermometer in Circle, Montana, that hadn't frozen solid. Robert Henshaw began making telephone calls as soon as the lines came back up. What he heard confirmed his worst fears. The preliminary reports suggested livestock losses across eastern Montana ranging from 12 to 23%, with some individual operations approaching 40% mortality. Tom Bradley reported 7 dead. Carl Peterson reported 13, with 4 more showing advanced symptoms of pneumonia and likely to die. The Johnsons, running a smaller operation near Jordan, had lost 19 of 46 head, 41% of their breeding stock gone. "Have you reached Erickson yet?" Henshaw asked his secretary. Still no answer. "The line may still be down, or they might be dead," was the unspoken conclusion. A 63-year-old man and his son, isolated on a ranch 5 miles from town, with a ramshackle hay structure that the entire Cattlemen's Association had declared unsafe. Henshaw decided to drive out there himself as soon as roads became passable. But Lars Erickson wasn't dead. He was standing inside his hay dome at 9:30 a.m. on January 13th, conducting the most methodical livestock inspection of his career. Martin recorded the data in his notebook, fingers numb despite heavy gloves. Interior temperature, 28 degrees Fahrenheit minus 2 degrees Celsius. Exterior temperature, minus 49 degrees Fahrenheit minus 45 degrees Celsius. Differential, 77 degrees Fahrenheit, 43 degrees Celsius. The mathematics were remarkable. 43 cattle, each generating approximately 1,500 BTUs per hour at rest, produced roughly 64,500 BTUs per hour total. A conventional barn, even a well-insulated modern one, typically experience heat loss rates of 40 to 60% due to air infiltration, thermal bridging, and radiant cooling through roof and walls. The hay dome experienced virtually no air infiltration. The entrance, angled and baffled, prevented direct wind penetration. The circular design eliminated corners where cold could collect, and the snow drift, that massive, unplanned addition to the structure's thermal envelope, had effectively tripled the total R value of the walls. Lars had never studied thermodynamics. He didn't know what a BTU was, and he'd never heard of R values. But he understood something more fundamental, that mass holds temperature that still air insulates, and that animals huddled together can create warmth sufficient to survive conditions that would kill them individually. He walked the perimeter of the structure, examining each animal with practiced efficiency. He checked eyes, bright and clear. He checked mucous membranes, pink and healthy. He examined hooves for frostbite, none detected. He listened to breathing, deep and regular. After 90 minutes of thorough inspection, his conclusion was definitive: 0 losses. Not one animal showing signs of cold stress. Total mortality, 0. Martin looked up from his notebook. Pa, they're going to think we're lying. Let them think what they want. You're writing down numbers. Numbers don't lie. But the numbers told a story that challenged everything the conventional ranching community believed about winter livestock management. Bradley's pole barn, with 4 propane heaters consuming roughly 8 gallons of fuel per day at peak cold, had maintained an average interior temperature of 14 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst of the blizzard. At an average exterior temperature of negative 42, that represented a 56-degree differential, impressive by conventional standards, but achieved at a fuel cost of approximately $340 per week. The hay dome, consuming 0 fuel and requiring 0 electricity, had maintained an average interior temperature of 29 degrees during the same period. At an average exterior temperature of negative 42, that represented a 71-degree differential, 15 degrees better than the modern barn, achieved through passive design and thermal mass alone. Feed consumption revealed another critical difference. Cattle require additional calories in cold weather to maintain body temperature. For every degree below 40 Fahrenheit, beef cattle require approximately 1 additional pound of hay per day to maintain body condition. At negative 40, Bradley's cattle were burning an extra 80 pounds of hay daily, 50% above their normal consumption. The hay dome cattle, protected from extreme cold and sheltered from wind chill, required only 15% additional feed, a negligible increase that Lars could easily supply from his own hay production. The financial mathematics were stark. Bradley's barn, 11 days of extreme cold propane, $374 additional feed, $192 livestock losses, 7 head at EST $200 per head, $1,400 total cost, $2,666 Erickson's hay dome, 11 days of extreme cold fuel, $0 additional feed, $127 livestock losses, $0 total cost, $127, but the true measure wasn't financial, it was biological. Bradley's surviving cattle had lost an average of 83 pounds each, putting their spring breeding prospects in jeopardy. They'd burned through body reserves fighting the cold, and they'd need months of recovery before breeding season. Erickson's cattle showed an average weight loss of only 12 pounds, within normal variation for winter weight fluctuation. They would enter breeding season in prime condition. The hay walls themselves revealed another crucial detail. When Lars cut into a test bale on the interior surface, He found the hay compressed but still dry. The moisture the cattle had produced, approximately 200 pounds of water vapor per day, had been absorbed into the hay's structure and gradually migrated outward through the walls, where it froze in the outer layers rather than creating dangerous condensation inside. This passive moisture management was something no mechanical ventilation system could match. Bradley's barn, despite its powered ventilation fans, had developed significant condensation on the interior walls, creating ice buildup that reduced thermal performance and created slip hazards. "It's the mass," Lars explained to Martin as they worked. "The hay is heavy, 16 tons total. That's weight, but it's also thermal mass. During the day, when the cattle are active and generating more heat, that mass absorbs the extra energy. At night, when they bed down and generate less heat, the walls release that stored warmth back into the space. It evens out the temperature swings." Modern building science would later confirm this intuition. Thermal mass, the capacity of a material to store and release heat, is measured in BTUs per cubic foot per degree Fahrenheit. Compressed hay has a thermal mass value of approximately 12 to 15 BTUs per cubic foot per degree, with roughly 2,500 cubic feet of hay in the walls. Calculated from bale dimensions and structure geometry, the dome contained thermal mass capable of storing approximately 30,000 to 37,500 BTUs per degree of temperature change. This meant that if interior temperature tried to drop suddenly, during a period of extreme outside cold, for example, the hay walls would release stored heat to resist that change. Conversely, if interior temperature tried to rise too much, during a period of high cattle activity, the walls would absorb the excess heat. The result was remarkable stability. Interior temperature variation of only 4 degrees over a 24-hour period, despite outside temperature variations of 30 degrees or more. By noon on January 13th, the temperature had warmed to negative 38 degrees. Lars and Martin began the process of digging out the entrance more thoroughly, creating a proper tunnel that would remain stable and allow easier access for feeding and inspection. As they worked, they saw a truck struggling up the county road in the distance, its wheels spinning in the deep snow, moving at perhaps 5 miles per hour. It took 20 minutes for the vehicle to cover the final mile to the Erickson Ranch. Robert Henshaw stepped out, his face wrapped in a wool scarf against the cold that bit through clothing like wire. "Are you men all right?" he called out. "We're fine," Lars shouted back. "Come see what we built." Henshaw approached the hay dome with visible skepticism. He saw the massive snow drift, the carefully dug entrance tunnel, the wisps of warm air vapor escaping from the opening. And then Lars led him inside. The transformation was immediate and profound. Stepping from negative 38 degrees into a space that registered 30 degrees Fahrenheit felt tropical. Henshaw pulled off his gloves instinctively, feeling warmth on his exposed skin for the first time in days. The 43 cattle stood calmly, chewing cud, their coats dry and their demeanor relaxed. Henshaw had inspected enough livestock operations to recognize healthy animals when he saw them. "How many did you lose?" he asked quietly. "None." Henshaw looked at Lars sharply. "None. 0. Not one." The extension agent walked the perimeter slowly, examining animals, checking for frostbite, observing behavior. He spent 40 minutes inside the structure, taking notes, asking questions, measuring temperature with a thermometer he brought. When he finally emerged back into the killing cold, his expression had changed completely. "Mr. Erickson," he said slowly, "I owe you an apology." "We all do." Lars just nodded. "No apology needed. You didn't know, but I should have known, or at least I should have been willing to learn." Henshaw looked back at the hay dome, then at his notes. "This structure performs better than any barn in the county, and it costs you nothing but labor. That's not ignorance. That's engineering we've forgotten." The accounting would continue over the next weeks as the cold gradually loosened its grip. But the fundamental truth was already clear. In the worst winter Montana had seen in 75 years, the old Norwegians' primitive hay pile had outperformed every modern barn in eastern Montana. And the implications of that fact were going to shake the ranching community to its foundation. The thaw came slowly, reluctantly. By February 3rd, daytime temperatures had climbed to a balmy 12 degrees above zero, though nights still plunged below -20. Snow that had fallen during the blizzard remained locked in place, compressed in a crystalline armor that wouldn't fully release its grip on the prairie until late March. But the ranching community couldn't wait for spring to begin the accounting. The Circle Cattlemen's Association called an emergency meeting for February 7th. Every rancher within 50 miles who could make the journey attended. 37 men crowding into Henderson's feed and grain, their faces showing the toll of the worst winter in living memory. Tom Bradley stood to deliver the preliminary report. His voice carried none of its usual confidence. "Gentlemen, the numbers are worse than we feared. Across our membership, we're looking at average livestock mortality of 16.4%. That's one animal in 6 dead. Feed costs are running 220% above normal. Fuel costs for those of us with heated barns are averaging $400 to $600 for January alone." He paused, consulting his notes with hands that weren't quite steady. Combined direct losses, livestock mortality, feed overruns, and fuel costs are estimated at $187,000 across our 37-member operations. That's an average of just over $5,000 per ranch. The silence in the room was profound. $5,000 represented 6 months' income for many of the men present. Some operations would never recover. At least 3 ranchers, Bradley knew, were already negotiating with banks about foreclosure. Carl Peterson raised his hand. "What about Erickson?" Bradley's jaw tightened. Lars Erickson reported 0 livestock losses. Total additional costs for the month of January, $127 in supplemental feed. The murmur that ran through the room mixed disbelief with something darker, resentment that one man's success threw their collective failure into such sharp relief. Robert Henshaw stood. The county extension agent had spent the past 3 weeks visiting every ranch he could reach, documenting conditions, collecting data, and, though he wouldn't say this aloud, wrestling with his own professional embarrassment. "I've inspected the Erickson operation personally," Henshaw said. "I've taken temperature measurements, examined the livestock, and analyzed the structure's performance against conventional barns. Gentlemen, I need to tell you something difficult. Everything we thought we knew about winter livestock housing may be wrong." He pulled out a chart he'd prepared, hand-drawn but meticulously detailed, showing comparative data, temperature differentials, inside versus outside, during peak cold. Modern pole barn, Bradley 56 degrees Fahrenheit average older conventional barn, Peterson 41 degrees Fahrenheit average hay dome structure, Erickson 71 degrees Fahrenheit average fuel costs, January 1st to 31st Bradley. Propane heating $612 Johnson. Wood stove supplemental $340 Erickson. No supplemental heat $0 livestock mortality. County average 16.4% best conventional. Operation 4.8% Henderson Erickson hay dome. 0% feed efficiency. Conventional barns 45 to 60% increase in consumption hay dome. 15% increase in consumption. The Erickson structure, Henshaw continued, achieved superior thermal performance through 3 primary mechanisms. First, exceptional insulation value. The combination of hay walls, air gaps, and snow accumulation created an effective R value exceeding 280. Second, thermal mass. Roughly 16 tons of hay that absorbed and released heat to stabilize interior temperature. Third, and perhaps most importantly, passive moisture management through the hygroscopic properties of the hay itself. He looked around the room at faces that ranged from skeptical to openly hostile. I wrote that structure off as dangerous and primitive. I was wrong. What Lars Erickson built represents vernacular engineering that's been proven over centuries in Scandinavia, and we dismissed it because it didn't match our modern assumptions. Tom Bradley stood again. "Bob, with respect, we can't all just build piles of hay and hope for the best. What if there'd been a fire? What if the structure had collapsed? We have liability, we have insurance requirements, we have county building codes." "You're right," Henshaw acknowledged. "But we also have 17 dead cattle, massive financial losses, in a community that nearly got wiped out by whether our grandfathers would have survived more easily. Maybe this should tell us something. The tension in the room was palpable. These were proud men, skilled ranchers who'd invested heavily in modern equipment and scientific methods. To be told that a 63-year-old Norwegian had outperformed them all with a technique their grandfathers would have recognized, it cut deep. But the numbers didn't lie. Lars Eriksson, who hadn't attended the meeting, learned about the discussion from Martin, who'd gone into town for supplies. That evening, over dinner, Martin asked the question that had been bothering him for weeks. "Pa, why didn't you tell people what you were doing? Why didn't you try to convince them?" Lars chewed his food slowly before answering. "Because you can't convince people of something they don't want to believe. You can only show them. And sometimes even showing them isn't enough. They have to see it fail their way before they'll consider there might be another way." But some ranchers didn't need any more convincing. On February 11th, Sam Henderson showed up at the Eriksson Ranch with his 2 sons and a truck full of hay bales. "Lars, I lost 9 head this winter. I can't afford to lose 9 more next year. Will you show me how to build one of these things?" Lars spent the afternoon walking Henderson through the construction principles. The circular foundation, the double wall design with air gaps, the critical importance of bale compression and orientation, the entrance angle and the dome shape. By evening, Henderson had a clear plan and the confidence to execute it. Within a week, 3 more ranchers had made the journey to the Eriksson place. By the end of February, Lars had consulted on 7 separate hay dome projects within a 50-mile radius. Tom Bradley watched this development with mixed feelings. His pole barn represented a significant investment, money he'd borrowed against his land and future production. The barn worked technically. It had kept most of his cattle alive, but it had cost him dearly in fuel, in feed, and in the 7 head he'd lost despite all his modern equipment. On February 23rd, he swallowed his pride and rode over to the Eriksson Ranch. Lars was mending fence when Bradley arrived. He straightened slowly, watching Bradley dismount. "Tom, Lars." Bradley stood silent for a long moment. "I came to say I was wrong. About your structure. About dismissing it. I was wrong." Lars nodded. You didn't know. I should have known. Or at least I should have been willing to look at it seriously." Bradley paused. "My grandfather had a saying. The man who thinks he knows everything is the man who learns nothing. I've been that man." "We all have," Lars said quietly. "It's not your fault. The world tells us that new is always better, that our fathers were ignorant, that traditional ways are just superstition. Sometimes that's true, but sometimes we throw away wisdom because we're too proud to admit our ancestors might have understood things we've forgotten." Bradley looked toward the hay dome, still mostly buried under its protective snow drift. "Will you show me how to build one?" "I will. But not just you. Bring your hands, bring your neighbors. This isn't a secret that should be kept. It's knowledge that should be shared." The informal school began in early March, as soon as weather permitted. 14 ranchers and 23 hired hands gathered at the Eriksson place over 3 days. Lars and Martin walked them through every detail. Foundation preparation, selecting level ground with good drainage, orienting for prevailing winds bale selection, compression standards, moisture content requirements, string placement wall construction, the double wall system, air gap maintenance, offset stacking patterns dome geometry, the gradual inward cant, load distribution principles, cap placement entrance design, width and height specifications, angle calculations, baffle effects, interior preparation, bedding depth, water system placement. Hay storage. Martin had prepared written instructions, copied by hand on his 17 sheets of paper that he distributed to the attendees. The document included rough sketches, critical measurements, and common mistakes to avoid. The most important thing, Lars emphasized repeatedly, is understanding why it works, not just copying what I did. If you understand the principles, insulation, thermal mass, moisture management, wind protection, you can adapt the design to your specific conditions. By late March, as snow finally began its reluctant retreat, the transformation was visible across eastern Montana. Circular foundations marked future hay dome sites on 7 ranches. 3 structures were already complete, rising like organic growth from the prairie landscape. Ranchers who'd never heard of R-values or thermal mass were suddenly discussing heat retention and passive climate control with the enthusiasm of converts. The county extension office, embarrassed by its initial dismissal of the Erickson structure, began official documentation of the hay dome technique. Henshaw commissioned a formal engineering study, hired a photographer to document construction methods, and prepared a bulletin for distribution across Montana and the Northern Plains states. By April, that bulletin had reached ranchers in Wyoming, North Dakota, and South Dakota. By summer, requests for information were coming from as far away as Minnesota and Idaho. The technique that Lars Erickson had preserved from his grandfather's memory, knowledge that had sustained Norwegian farmers through Arctic winters for generations, was spreading across the American West. And it was doing so not through government programs or university research, but through the oldest form of technology transfer humanity has ever known, one neighbor showing another what works. The 1949 to 1950 winter would be milder, testing the new structures under less extreme conditions. But by the winter of 1951 to 1952, another severe season, though not as brutal as 49, the results were conclusive. Ranches with hay domes reported mortality rates 70 to 85% lower than those relying solely on conventional barns. Fuel costs dropped precipitously. Feed efficiency improved. And quietly, without fanfare or official recognition, a technology that agricultural science had dismissed as primitive became standard practice across thousands of square miles of northern rangeland. Tom Bradley never built a hay dome. His pride and his debt load kept him committed to his pole barn, but he stopped criticizing those who did. And when younger ranchers asked his advice about winter housing, he always said the same thing: go talk to Lars Erickson. That old Norwegian knows more about keeping cattle alive in winter than all the agricultural colleges combined. It was, in its own way, the highest compliment one rancher could pay another. Spring 1953. For years after the winter that nearly broke Montana's ranching community, a graduate student from Montana State College stood in Lars Erickson's yard, notebook in hand, attempting to explain why the hay dome shouldn't work. The engineering manuals say you need mechanical ventilation to prevent moisture buildup, the young man insisted. They say you need supplemental heating below 20 degrees. They say thermal mass is irrelevant without active solar collection systems. Lars, now 67 and moving a bit slower than he had 4 years earlier, just smiled. And yet it works. But why? Because the manuals were written by people who never spent a winter in a Norwegian mountain valley. They know a lot about buildings, but they don't know much about survival. By 1953, the hay dome technique had spread to over 400 ranches across 5 states. The structures varied in size from modest 20-foot diameter shelters for small herds to massive 60-foot versions that could house over 100 head. Ranchers had adapted the basic design to local conditions, some incorporating stone foundations, others adding canvas covers for additional wind protection, still others experimenting with mixed materials like sod and hay. But the fundamental principles remained the same: circular design, double wall construction, thermal mass, passive moisture management, and dome geometry. The economic impact was measurable. A 1952 study by the Montana Agricultural Extension Service calculated that ranchers using hay domes save an average of $1,200 per winter in reduced fuel costs and lower livestock mortality. Across the 400 documented installations, that represented nearly $500,000 in annual savings, money that stayed in rural communities instead of going to fuel suppliers and veterinarians. But the deeper impact was cultural. The winter of 1949 had taught a generation of ranchers something uncomfortable: that progress isn't always linear, that newer isn't always better, and that their grandfather's generation might have understood certain fundamental truths that modern education had obscured. It was a lesson that extended beyond hay domes. Ranchers began reconsidering other traditional practices they'd abandoned. Root cellars, once dismissed as obsolete, experienced a revival. Their passive temperature control proving more reliable than mechanical refrigeration during power outages. Traditional windbreak planting patterns, replaced by simplified modern designs, were re-examined and often reinstated. Even old methods of water management, earthen dams and dugouts, gained new respect as ranchers realized that technologies requiring no fuel and no maintenance had inherent advantages in remote, harsh environments. Tom Bradley's operation eventually adopted some of these traditional methods, though never the hay dome itself. His pole barn stood as a monument to modern agricultural engineering, expensive, fuel-dependent, and effective. But alongside it, he built a root cellar using techniques his grandfather would have recognized. And when power outages hit during the severe winter of 1954, that root cellar kept his family fed while freezers full of meat thawed and spoiled at his neighbors' places. I guess the old ways and the new ways don't have to be enemies, he admitted to Lars over coffee one spring morning. Maybe the smart thing is knowing which tool to use for which job. Lars nodded. That's all I ever tried to do. Use what works. Robert Henshaw's career took an unexpected turn. His documentation of the hay dome technique and his frank acknowledgement of how agricultural science had dismissed traditional knowledge attracted attention from researchers studying vernacular architecture. He eventually left the County Extension Service to teach at Montana State College, where he developed a program specifically focused on traditional building techniques and their modern applications. We spent 50 years teaching students that everything their ancestors did was wrong, Henshaw said in a 1956 lecture that would be quoted for decades. Then one winter proved that everything we'd been teaching might be wrong. That's a humbling lesson, but it's one we desperately needed. The hay dome technique even crossed international boundaries. A Norwegian agricultural delegation visiting Montana in 1954 encountered the structures and were shocked to discover that American ranchers were using techniques that had largely died out in Scandinavia itself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Knowledge that originated in Norway, preserved by immigrants in Montana, was now being reintroduced to Norway by American agricultural advisors. But not everyone was convinced. Modern agricultural colleges continued to teach conventional barn design. Federal agricultural programs still subsidized mechanized, fuel-dependent livestock housing systems. Insurance companies remained skeptical of hay structures, often refusing coverage or charging premium rates. And a new generation of ranchers, educated in university programs that emphasize technology and mechanization, often looked at hay domes with the same skepticism their fathers had shown in 1948. The cycle, Lars noted wryly, seemed to repeat itself every generation. By the late 1950s, cheap fuel and improved rural electrification made heated barns more economically viable. Some ranchers abandoned their hay domes, viewing them as temporary solutions from a crisis period. The technique didn't disappear. It remained widespread in remote areas where fuel costs were prohibitive, but it lost its revolutionary status and settled into the background of normal practice. Lars Eriksson died in 1961 at 75 from causes unrelated to winter cold. His obituary in the Circle newspaper noted his ranching career but made no mention of the hay dome that had revolutionized winter livestock management across the northern plains. That knowledge, it seemed, had already been forgotten by those who hadn't lived through the winter of 1949. Martin continued the ranch, maintaining the original hay dome and building a second one in 1963. He also began documenting his father's techniques in more detail, interviewing the ranchers who'd learned from Lars and collecting photographs of hay dome structures before they disappeared from the landscape. By 1975, when Martin donated his father's papers to the Montana Historical Society, fewer than 70 hay domes remained in active use. The technique hadn't been disproven. It still worked exactly as it always had, but it had been marginalized by industrial agriculture's relentless push towards standardization and mechanization. And then, in the early 2000s, something unexpected happened. The internet allowed scattered ranchers to share experiences across vast distances. Online forums dedicated to sustainable agriculture and off-grid living began discussing traditional techniques. And inevitably, someone found Martin Ericsson's documentation and posted photographs of the original 1948 hay dome. The response was immediate and enthusiastic. A new generation of ranchers, often younger people returning to the land, interested in sustainable practices and fuel independence, rediscovered the hay dome technique. They built them, documented their performance, shared results, and improved the design with modern materials like tarp covers and better insulation methods. By 2015, an estimated 300 new hay domes have been built across North America, with international interest emerging from Canada, Iceland, and even Mongolia, where herders recognize similarities to their own traditional livestock shelters. The circle had completed itself. Knowledge that began in pre-industrial Scandinavia, carried to Montana by immigrants, nearly lost during the mechanization of agriculture, and finally rediscovered by a generation seeking alternatives to industrial farming systems. Today, agricultural universities teach hay dome construction in sustainable agriculture programs. Engineering students study the structures as examples of passive climate control and vernacular architecture. And somewhere in eastern Montana, on the land that Lars Ericsson once ranched, a hay dome still stands, maintained now as a historical landmark, a testament to the stubborn wisdom of one old Norwegian who refused to believe that traditional knowledge was worthless. The winter of 1949 taught many lessons. It taught that survival isn't about having the most expensive equipment or the newest technology. It taught that knowledge accumulated over generations has value that can't be replaced by college education or government programs. And most importantly, it taught that dismissing traditional practices as primitive or ignorant often reveals not their limitations, but our own. Lars Ericsson never claimed to have invented anything. He always said he was just remembering, preserving knowledge his grandfather had given him, knowledge that stretched back through generations of Norwegian farmers who'd learned, through trial and error and survival, how to keep animals alive in conditions that would kill them otherwise. My grandfather used to say that a smart man learns from his mistakes, Lars told Martin shortly before he died. But a wise man learns from other people's mistakes. And the wisest man learns from the knowledge his ancestors already paid for with their survival. That hay dome, rising from the prairie snow in the winter of 1949, represented more than just clever engineering or traditional knowledge. It represented humility, the willingness to admit that maybe, just maybe, the old ways deserved respect. That maybe our ancestors weren't ignorant. That maybe they'd figured out solutions to problems we keep trying to solve with more complexity and more expense. In the end, that's the real legacy of the hay dome. Not the structure itself, but the lesson it taught, that sometimes the best way forward is to remember what came before. If you've made it this far, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, what traditional knowledge from your family or your region has been forgotten that deserves to be remembered? And if this story changed how you think about modern versus traditional methods, hit that like button and subscribe. Because the world is full of Lars Ericssons, people quietly preserving wisdom that the rest of us have dismissed, and their stories deserve to be told. The winter of 1949 nearly destroyed Montana's ranching community. Instead, it became the crucible that proved something humanity keeps forgetting, that survival isn't about having the newest solution. It's about having the right solution. And sometimes, the right solution is the one our grandfathers knew all along.